kind of grief that does not announce itself. It does not collapse a man in public or make him cry at funerals or cause him to neglect his kingdom. It is quieter than that, and in many ways more total. It is the grief of a man who loved a woman so completely that when she died, he simply stopped. Not externally. Externally, Alpha King Everett Maddox of Veldrath continued to rule. He continued to hold court, sign documents, manage borders, and discipline soldiers. He continued to eat his meals and attend his councils and speak in complete sentences to people who required it of him. But inside, the man had gone somewhere very far away and left only the king behind. For 5 years, this was the arrangement. And then, on an unremarkable Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of autumn, a new servant arrived at Veldrath Keep. She was brought in with a group of 12 others from the southern territories. She was assigned to the lower kitchens. She kept her head down and her hair braided and her eyes on the floor. She was nobody. She was, by every official measure, entirely invisible. And then King Everett Maddox walked through the great hall on his way to the War Council, and she turned to move out of his path, and he looked up at exactly the wrong moment, and the tray she was carrying fell from her hands and shattered across the stone floor, and every person in that hall went completely silent. Because the king had stopped walking. He had stopped breathing. His face had done something that no one in 5 years had seen it do. It had broken. Her name was Wren Calloway. And she had no idea, not yet, that she was wearing a dead woman's face. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Chapter 1. Wren Calloway had been making herself small since she was 7 years old. It was not something she had been taught exactly, more something she had understood instinctively, the way certain animals understand that stillness is safer than motion, that being overlooked is its own form of armor. She grew up in Caldermere, the southernmost province of Veldrath, in a village so small it did not appear on most official maps. The woman who raised her, a quiet seamstress the village knew as Sarah, had cared for Wren alone with a combination of fierce love and careful instruction. Sarah was not her birth mother. Wren had understood this in the vague, unexamined way of children who sense a truth before they have the language for it, in the careful distance Sarah kept from certain questions, within the way she never spoke of Wren's father or her origins with anything approaching ease. But Sarah had loved her. That part was never in question. "Don't be noticed," Sarah used to say, not unkindly, while braiding Wren's dark hair with her deft seamstress fingers. "People who get noticed get examined. People who get examined get complicated." Wren had always understood that this was not generic wisdom. It was specific, personal. It was her guardian telling her, in the gentlest possible way, that something about Wren herself required protection, not from the world's cruelty, but from its attention. What that something was, Sarah Calloway had taken to her grave when Wren was 19. She died of a fever in the late autumn of the year Wren turned 19, quickly, without warning. In the specific, merciless way of illnesses that do not build up to themselves, but simply arrive fully formed. There had been time for very little in those final hours. Sarah had gripped her hand and said 2 things. The first was, "You look exactly like her. I always knew this day would come." The second was a name, spoken once in a whisper so faint that Wren could not be entirely certain she had heard it correctly. Queen Mira. Wren had held both of these things carefully in the years since, turning them over the way you turn over objects you cannot identify, trying to understand what they were for. She knew Queen Mira by the same peripheral knowledge everyone in Veldrath had. The beloved queen who had died 5 years ago, the loss that had permanently altered the king's face, the woman whose portrait still hung in every province hall because no one had dared remove it. But the connection between herself and a dead queen whose name her dying guardian had whispered, this she could not map. She tried, in the first years after Sarah's death, to understand it. But Caldermere was a village with no library and no records, and the people who might have known something were people Sarah had clearly and deliberately kept her away from. So she set the question down. She survived. She found work where work was available, first as a seamstress's assistant in the village, then as a traveling helper in the merchant routes, and finally, at 24, as part of a service group recruited from the Southern Territories to staff Veldrath Keep. She had not applied for the position out of curiosity. She had applied because the wage was 3 times anything she could earn in Caldermere, and she was tired of being cold. She had kept her hair braided. She had kept her eyes on the floor. She had been doing this successfully for 3 days. And then on the 4th morning, she had turned around in the great hall with a breakfast tray and looked directly into the face of King Everett Maddox. And the look on his face had told her, without any ambiguity at all, that whatever Sarah had been protecting her from, it had just found her anyway. What had Sarah seen in Wren's face that had made her so careful for 19 years? And why had a dead queen's name been the last word she ever said? Chapter 2. King Everett Maddox was the alpha of the Veldrath pack, a man whose very presence commanded the air in the room to go still. To his people, he was a mountain of power, but to those who could catch his scent, he was a desert, dry, cold, and devoid of the life fire that usually marked a true alpha. For 5 years, his inner wolf had been silent, curled in the dark corners of his mind, mourning a Luna who had been ripped away before their bond could fully settle. He wasn't just a king who had stopped feeling. He was an alpha who had lost his moon, leaving him a hollow, dangerous predator governed only by duty. He didn't just walk into a room, he reclaimed it. Like 20 years of absolute rule had carved a specific kind of gravity into Everett Maddox. To look at him was to understand that you were in the presence of a predator who had forgotten what it felt like to be hunted. He was 45 years old and had the specific appearance of a man who had once been warmer than he currently was. It was visible in the structure of his face. The lines around his mouth suggested they had been made by smiling, not frowning, and yet his mouth in its current default position was set in something that was not quite either. His eyes were dark, a gray-green that changed with the quality of the light and had, by all accounts from people who had known him before, once been remarkable for how much animation they held. Now they held efficiency, clarity. The precise assessment of a man who had learned to interact with the world through the clean, manageable lens of what needed to be done rather than what was being felt. His advisors had various names for this quality. Chancellor Ford, who had served 3 kings and had the diplomatic vocabulary to match, called it composure. Captain of the Guard Briggs, who had known the king since boyhood and therefore had fewer illusions about what it actually was, called it something he only said in private and only after his 3rd drink. His name for it was the absence. The absence had descended approximately 3 days after Queen Mira died. He had stood at her funeral and been present in the way kings are required to be present, upright, composed, fulfilling the symbolic function of a ruler absorbing a national grief on behalf of his people. And then he had returned to his study and shut the door, and the next morning when he emerged, something had changed in him so fundamentally and so quietly that it took most of his court 2 weeks to identify what was missing. He had not broken. He had simply reorganized, around the fact of her absence, around the negative space she had left in every room she had ever been in, every conversation they had ever had, every plan they had made together that now existed only as a record of things that would not happen. He had loved Mira Hartwell Maddox with the specific totality of a man who had not expected to love anyone. He had been 22 when they married, a political arrangement between two territories. Ice agreed before he had any say in the matter, and he had been prepared to be decent to her, to be fair and kind and correct, without expecting anything further. And then she had walked into his study on their third day of marriage to return a book she had borrowed from his shelf, and she had said something so unexpectedly precise about the book's argument that he had asked her to sit down, and she had sat, and they had talked for 4 hours. He had fallen in love with her in the way certain falls happen, not all at once, but with a momentum that becomes obvious only when you are already most of the way down. By the time they had been married a year, he could not remember what the version of himself that had not loved her had felt like. When she died, he did not want to find out. So he had stopped feeling, not by decision or not consciously, but by the steady daily practice of redirecting. Every time something moved in him that was not useful, he redirected it toward work, toward decisions, toward the clean, frictionless surface of governance where everything had a correct answer and nothing required him to be present in the soft, exposed way that love had always required. It had worked, more or less, for 5 years. And then a servant girl with dark braided hair and downcast eyes had turned around in his great hall, and he had seen her face, and 5 years of careful, meticulous reconstruction had cracked clean down the center in approximately 2 seconds. He had built 5 years of walls in 48 months, and one girl's face had undone all of it in the time it took to exhale. But was it grief he was feeling, or something else entirely? Chapter 3. Nobody told her directly. This was the thing Wren would later understand was not an accident. It was a policy. An unspoken collective decision made in the immediate aftermath of that moment in the Great Hall, when every person present had seen the king's face do what it did, and every person present had then looked at Wren, and every person present had reached the same conclusion at the same moment, and then all chosen simultaneously to say nothing about it to her face. She knew something had happened. She was not obtuse. The tray had fallen. The hall had gone silent. The king had stood there for what felt like a very long time looking at her with an expression she did not have a name for, something raw and enormous living behind the controlled surface of a face that clearly did not often let anything through. And then his chamberlain, a precise small man named Aldous Webb, had appeared at the king's elbow and said something quiet and urgent, and the king had turned and walked away without speaking, and the hall had slowly, carefully resumed its noise. She had gathered the broken pieces of the tray. She had been reassigned by midday, moved from the lower kitchens to a position in the upper household, which was a significant elevation for someone 3 days into her tenure, and which 3 separate colleagues had looked at her with expressions that were difficult to decode when they told her. Her new duties placed her in the corridors and rooms of the upper keep, closer, in other words, to the places the king moved through. She told herself this was coincidence. She did not believe herself. The first time she saw Queen Mira's portrait, hung at the top of the eastern staircase, large and formally painted, the queen in ceremonial dress, Wren stopped walking. She stood on the stairs and looked up at the portrait and felt a sensation she had no clean language for. It was not like looking in a mirror. The queen was more formally beautiful, her posture carrying the specific trained elegance of someone raised to be looked at. Her hair was dressed elaborately, Her expression was composed. She was wearing a crown, but the bone structure, the particular set of the eyes, the specific shape of the mouth. Wren lifted one hand and pressed her fingertips against her own jaw, the way you press something to test whether it is real. "You've seen it then," said a voice behind her. She turned. A woman in her 50s, stocky and practical in the uniform of the senior household staff, was watching her from the landing above with an expression that was equal parts apology and assessment. Her name, Wren would learn, was Hattie Bloom, head of housekeeping, 23 years of service to Veldrath Keep. She had been Queen Mira's favorite among the household staff. "Seen what?" Wren asked. Hattie Bloom looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at the portrait, then back at Wren. "Come with me," she said. "There are things you need to know before the king decides to tell you himself. And trust me when I say, you want to hear it from me first." 20 years of loyalty to a dead queen. And now this woman was looking at Wren like she was either a miracle or a catastrophe, and had not yet decided which. Chapter 4. They sat in Hattie's small office off the linen corridor, a room that smelled of lavender and wool and the specific orderliness of a person who had spent decades managing beautiful things that belonged to other people. Hattie poured 2 cups of tea without asking and set one in front of Wren and wrapped both hands around her own, and then looked at the surface of the liquid for a long moment before she spoke, in the careful way of someone choosing the order of words as though the order mattered. "Queen Mira was the first princess of the Ashfeld Kingdom," Hattie began. "Not an average girl, Wren. She was high-born, gold-blooded, and destined for this throne since she could walk. 25 years ago, she was sent south on a diplomatic tour. She was 18, reckless, and she fell in love with a man from the southern border territories whose name she burned from every record she could find afterward. She got pregnant." Hattie leaned in closer. Her family, the Ashfeld royals, spent 4 years hiding her away to scrub your existence from history. They couldn't let the world know their prize princess had a daughter outside of marriage. They waited until the situation was buried. And then, when she was 23, they arranged her marriage to King Everett to seal the Great Treaty. They were married for 15 years, Wren. She was his Luna, his partner, his everything. But she lived every second of those 15 years carrying a secret, protecting you by pretending you never existed. She arranged for a trusted guardian in Caldermere, a seamstress named Sarah Calloway, who was paid handsomely and sworn to absolute silence, to raise you as her own. Mira chose the king's throne not out of ambition, but to save your village from consequences that would have been devastating. She didn't stay away because she didn't care. She stayed away because her shadow was a death sentence for you. Hattie looked at Wren steadily across the teacups. "You were that secret. Mira Hartwell Maddox was your birth mother. The woman who raised you, Sarah, kept her promise until the very end. She gave you the queen's name with her last breath so that when the time came you would know where to look." The room was very quiet. Outside the small window, the keep's inner courtyard was visible. Guards crossing, supply carts being unloaded, the ordinary machinery of a working castle. None of it seemed relevant to what was happening in this room. Wren sat with this information for a very long time. She thought about Sarah's hands in her hair, braiding it, always braiding it, the careful devotion of a woman who had loved someone else's child as completely as if she had been her own. She thought about, "You look exactly like her." She thought about the king's face in the great hall, that particular expression, and understood for the first time what she had actually been looking at. It had not been the grief of a man seeing his dead wife's ghost. It had been something more complicated, more specific. He had been looking at her the way you look at someone who carries pieces of the person you loved, who is not that person, could never be that person, but in whose face you can see the echo of something you have been starving for 5 years. She thought, this is either the most dangerous thing that has ever happened to me, or it is the thing Sarah spent 19 years trying to prevent. And she understood, with the cold clarity of someone who has just seen the shape of a situation she cannot escape, that those two things might be the same sentence. She was the dead queen's daughter, raised in hiding by a guardian sworn to silence, and the king, the man who had loved her birth mother for 15 years, had just looked at her face with grief and something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with ghosts at all. Chapter 5. The summons came on the 7th day, a folded note delivered by Aldous Webb himself, which was unusual. The Chamberlain did not generally deliver notes to lower household staff, and which said only, "The king requests your presence in the East Study, tonight, after the 9th bell." There was no signature. There was no indication that this was optional. Wren read it 3 times. Then she refolded it along its original creases and put it in the pocket of her work dress and went back to the linen she had been pressing and pressed it with the focused attention of someone who needs her hands to be doing something ordinary while her mind does something else entirely. She told Hattie. Hattie's response was to look at her for a long moment and then say, "Don't wear your work clothes." Wren looked down at herself. "What should I wear?" "Something that fits you properly," Hattie said. "Something that reminds you that you are a person and not a function." She arrived at the East Study at the 9th bell, wearing a dark gray dress that Hattie had produced from somewhere. Well cut, simple, clearly not a servant's uniform, with her hair unbraided and loose around her shoulders. She knocked twice. A voice said, "Come in." As Wren stepped into the room, Everett's head snapped toward her with predatory speed. It wasn't just her face. It was her scent. It was faint, hidden under the smell of laundry soap and kitchen herbs, but underneath was the unmistakable golden sweet aroma of the Hartwell bloodline. A low, involuntary vibration started in his chest, a sound that was half growl, half purr. It was the sound of an alpha recognizing something he had thought was extinct. His voice held the texture of dark earth and jagged stone, the kind of voice that made a woman's pulse skip not out of fear, but out of a sudden, deep-seated instinct to belong to him. "Sit," he said. She sat. He remained standing, which she suspected was not accidental, a way of managing the conversation's geometry. "You've been told," he said. Not a question. "By Hattie Bloom." "Yes." His jaw tightened slightly. "I had intended to tell you myself." "I know," she said. "I think she was trying to protect me." Something moved through his expression. "From me?" "From information with no context," she said. "She gave me the context first." He turned back to the window. Outside, the night sky over Veldrath was thick with stars. Was the kind of clear, cold sky that made everything feel more exposed than it should. "Your birth mother," he said, and the words had a specific weight in his mouth. "Queen Mira." "Yes." "I never knew Sarah existed," he said, meaning Wren herself, the daughter, the secret. "Not until Mira died. She left a letter with the estate documents, private, not for the official record." He paused. "She told me about Sarah Calloway, the guardian who raised you. She told me about you. She asked me to look after you if the need arose." Wren was quiet. "And the need didn't arise," she said, "for 5 years." "No," he said. "I was not—" He stopped, redirected. "I was not in a position to act on it properly until recently." She looked at his profile against the window, and thought about what Hattie had said about the absence, and understood that what he meant by not being in a position was something far more interior than logistics. "I spent 15 years sharing a life with her," Everett rasped, his eyes flashing a momentary primal gold. "I thought I knew the scent of her soul. I thought our bond was total. And then you walk in and I realize that for 15 years, she held a piece of herself back. She was protecting a daughter I never knew I had the right to protect." He looked at Wren with the weary, heavy power of a 45-year-old alpha. "You aren't just a girl who looks like her. You are the truth she died carrying. And my wolf doesn't know whether to howl in grief for her or in fury that I was kept from you for so long." He took one breath, then another. "You smell like her bloodline," he rasped. "But your heartbeat is faster, stronger, like a huntress." She thought, "I am looking at the ruins of a love story that happened before I was born." And she felt, unexpectedly, inconveniently, that it was one of the most devastating things she had ever understood about another person. He had known about her for 5 years. He had a letter. He had chosen not to come. And now she was sitting in his study in a borrowed dress, trying to understand whether she was here because of duty or because of something neither of them had names for yet. He had known about her for 5 years. He had Mira's letter. He had chosen not to come. And now she was sitting in his study in a borrowed dress, trying to understand whether she was here because of duty or because of something neither of them had names for yet. Chapter 6. If you're feeling the pull of this story right now, you belong here. Subscribe. I post a new complete romance every single week, and you will never have to worry about cliffhangers. She did not see him for 3 days after the study meeting. Not by accident. Veldrath Keep was large, but not that large, and Wren had learned its rhythms quickly. She avoided the routes he was known to take. She told herself this was sensible. She told herself she needed time to settle the information she had been given into something she could carry without it disrupting her balance. She almost believed herself. On the 4th day, he found her in the portrait gallery. She had gone there deliberately, stood in front of the large, formal portrait of Queen Mira, and looked at it with the specific, focused attention of someone trying to understand their own face. Not the face of a servant, not the face of a stranger, her own face, her birth mother's face. She had been standing there for perhaps 10 minutes when she heard footsteps behind her and turned and found him there. They both went still for a moment in the way of 2 people caught doing something they had not intended to do in company. "I come here sometimes," he said, as if offering an explanation she had not asked for. "I know," she said. "Hattie told me." The corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but the memory of where one used to live. He came to stand beside her, at a slight and careful distance, and they both looked at the portrait for a moment. "She would have wanted to know you," he said. "I believe that." He said it quietly. Not as a comfort, as a fact. The distinction mattered to Wren, who had received enough hollow comforts in her life to have developed an acute sensitivity to them. This was not hollow. He meant it. She looked at the portrait and then looked at the line of his jaw and thought about what it meant to love someone completely and then discover that everything you built together was constructed over a secret. She felt something shift in her chest. Not grief, exactly. Something adjacent to grief. The feeling of inheriting a loss that belonged to someone else but had been left to you in the will anyway. "May I ask you something?" she said. He turned slightly toward her. "Oh, yes." "When you look at me," she stopped, chose the words with the careful precision of someone handling something fragile. "Is it difficult to look at me and not see her?" The silence that followed was not empty. It was the specific silence of a man who has been asked the one question he has been rehearsing the answer to, and has just decided to abandon the rehearsed version entirely. "It was," he said, "the first moment. In the hall when you turned. Yes, for 2 seconds I was looking at a ghost." His voice dropped. "And then you dropped the tray, and you said something sharp and practical about the broken ceramic, and I thought—" He stopped. Something moved through his expression that she had no name for yet. "You are not her," he said. "You share a face, a bloodline, but you are entirely, specifically, inconveniently yourself. And I find that I cannot stop thinking about who that person is." The word "cannot" landed somewhere between them like a stone dropped into still water. She felt the ripples of it move through her before she fully understood what he had said. She was back in her room an hour later, her hand pressed flat against her sternum, staring at the ceiling with the specific expression of a woman who has just realized she is already falling and cannot identify the moment it began. "This," she thought, "is going to destroy me." And felt, against every warning Sarah had ever given her, that she was willing. He had just told her she was not a ghost to him, that she was someone he couldn't stop thinking about. And the word "cannot" had lodged somewhere in her chest like a coal, small and dark and very, very warm. Chapter 7. It started with books, but it did not stay there. Wren had found the library on her 8th day and had been using it as a refuge, a place where she could disappear into someone else's world and stop thinking about the weight of her own. What she had not accounted for was that he would find her there. On the 12th evening, she was at one of the long oak tables, 3 volumes of Veldrath history open in front of her, her notes filling the margins of a small folded paper, when she heard the library door open and every nerve in her body identified who it was before she lifted her eyes. She had stopped pretending, by this point, that she did not notice when he entered a room. His presence had a specific quality, not just the alpha dominance that made everyone in the keep unconsciously adjust their posture, but something underneath it, something that her blood responded to with an urgency she had spent 2 weeks trying to classify as ordinary and was increasingly certain was not. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her. She looked up. He looked at the books. She watched him identify what she was reading, watched something deliberate cross his face, the expression of a man who has been given an opening and is deciding in real time whether to take it. He took it. He crossed the library and sat across from her, not beside her, the table still between them, the careful geography of 2 people who are not yet ready to abandon the pretense of distance, and said, "You have questions?" "Yes," she said. "Ask them," he said. And so she did. But the questions she was asking, and the questions she actually needed answered, these were not the same ones at all. She asked about the diplomatic tour, about the records, about the period 25 years ago when a young princess from Ashfeld had spent 3 months in the South and returned changed in ways her family had spent years covering up. He answered directly and without obvious omission, which she noticed and filed. He told her about Mira, not the queen, not the Luna, but the girl who had found official events suffocating and had disappeared from them whenever she could. The girl who had, by all accounts in the letter, walked into a market in Caldermere and met a seamstress named Sarah, who spoke to her as though she were ordinary. Sarah was the first person Mira had met in years who didn't know what she was, he said quietly, and she treated her accordingly. Wren thought about Sarah, her careful hands, on her deliberately unremarkable life, the 19 years she had devoted to protecting a secret she had been paid to keep and had chosen, instead, to love. She would have been good at that, Wren said. making someone feel ordinary. "Yes," Everett said. "I imagine she would." They sat in the lamplight with the history books between them, and Wren felt the particular thing that happens when a conversation opens up a space larger than the words inside it. When two people are talking about one thing and both aware they are also talking about something else entirely. His knee was perhaps 8 inches from hers under the table. She was aware of those 8 inches in a way she had no use for. They were there for 2 hours. When she finally closed the last book and gathered herself to leave, he stood when she stood, an automatic courtly gesture that probably cost him nothing and struck her with disproportionate force. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked. It was casual. Almost. She looked at him across the library table and thought about his loneliness, the deep, structural kind, the kind that had become so familiar to him that he no longer recognized it as a wound. And then she thought about the word, cannot. She made a decision. It was small. It would probably rearrange everything. "Same time tomorrow," she said, "but sit beside me." He went very still. She held his gaze and did not look away and did not qualify it and did not make it easier for either of them. "The table between us," she said quietly, "is a pretense we are both too intelligent to keep maintaining." Something shifted in his face, slow, tectonic, irreversible. "Yes," he said. The single syllable held more weight than most speeches she had heard. "Beside you. Tomorrow." She left the library before he could see what saying it had done to her expression. She made it exactly 12 steps into the corridor before she pressed her back against the cold stone wall, closed her eyes, and allowed herself 10 full seconds of complete internal chaos. Then she straightened, braided her hair back, walked to her room, and did not sleep. 2 people in a library, talking about one thing and meaning another entirely. She had just asked him to sit beside her. He had said yes without hesitation, and neither of them would be the same on the other side of tomorrow. Chapter 8. 3 weeks of library evenings. This was the distance between who they had been on the day she arrived and who they were becoming. 3 weeks of sitting at that long oak table, beside each other now, the table's geography permanently shifted, with the oil lamps burning and the rest of the keep going about its evening, and the conversation moving the way conversations move when 2 people are genuinely interested in each other's minds. He listened to her speak about Caldermere with the focused attention of someone who was not performing interest but genuinely experiencing it. He asked follow-up questions. He remembered details she had mentioned the previous evening and wove them into later questions, which was, she had come to understand, one of the most quietly devastating things a person could do. Pay attention so consistently that the other person began to feel in small daily accumulations visible. She was beginning to feel visible. This was the dangerous part, because she had not been prepared for him to be interesting. She had been prepared for him to be grief-struck or possessive or caught in the particular loop of trying to replace something irreplaceable through someone who resembled it. He was not doing that. He was looking at her and seeing, with increasing accuracy and attention, exactly what she actually was. The evening it shifted, really shifted, past the point of comfortable ambiguity, began ordinarily. He was already at the table when she arrived, with work documents rather than books, which told her he had been there before she came and had not been able to make himself leave. She sat beside him. He set the documents aside. They talked. At some point, she could not afterward identify when exactly. The distance between them was no longer safe. He had leaned forward to look at something in the book she was reading, and she had leaned forward to point at the relevant passage, and the warmth of him across that contracted space was something she had no strategy for. "Ren," he said. Just that. Just her name. And the way he said it, not as a functional label, not as an address, but as a word he was tasting, testing, learning the weight of, put her heart directly against the back of her ribcage with a force that had nothing gentle about it. "Don't," she said. Her voice was level. She was proud of how level it was. "Don't what?" "Don't say my name like that unless you mean it," she said. "Everett," she said. "I know what I am. I'm the living proof that your 15-year marriage had a secret." "It's real," he said, stepping into her space. "I am 45 years old, Ren. I am past the age of chasing ghosts or playing at romantic fantasies. I loved Mira for 15 years, and I will honor that until I die. But what I feel when you argue with me, when you look at me with that southern fire in your eyes, that belongs to you. I am not looking for a second chance with her. I am looking for a first chance with you." "I have outlived my enemies and my own heart," he whispered, his hand hovering just inches from her hair. "I don't have the patience for games, and I am too old to lie to myself. I haven't felt the pull of the moon in 5 years, but tonight, looking at you, my wolf is screaming that you are the only thing in this kingdom that matters. Does that terrify you? It should, because I have never lost anything I decided to keep." His jaw tightened. "You challenge me," he said. "You argue with my conclusions when you disagree with them. You are funny in a way that catches me off guard. You have an opinion about everything, and you deliver it with a confidence that your position in this keep should not technically permit." He pressed one hand flat on the table between them. She thought about all the things that Hand had signed and decided and managed in the years since Mira died. "I'm afraid," she said quietly, "of this." "Yes," he said. "So am I." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, dense with everything they were not yet saying and both already feeling. Under the table, her foot touched his. Neither of them moved it away. The age between them wasn't a gap. It was a bridge. He had the wisdom she lacked, and she had the fire he had thought was extinguished forever. An inch of space between them and a confession neither of them had planned. And under the table, the specific, electric, terrifying contact of two people who have just acknowledged, without words, that they are falling. But something in the keep had been watching, and not everyone wanted the dead queen's daughter to be seen. Chapter 9. Chancellor Ford had managed Veldrath's political machinery for 17 years, and he had managed it, in his own estimation, well. He was not a cruel man. He was a practical one. And practically speaking, the emergence of a girl with Mira Hartwell's face in the lower household of Veldrath Keep was not a development that could be allowed to progress without management. He had identified the situation within 48 hours of Ren's arrival. He had sources. He always had sources. A girl with no position, no title, no political utility, and a bloodline that, if it became publicly known, would raise uncomfortable questions about the late queen's past. This girl was a problem. He arranged for her records to be reviewed. He found a procedural irregularity in her hiring documentation. He brought it to the keeper of household records. Ren Calloway's service contract was due to be voided within the week on the grounds of incomplete credentials. He had not anticipated Hattie Bloom. Hattie Bloom had sources of her own. She told the king at 6 a.m, standing in his private reception room, telling him everything she had found in the specific direct way of a woman who had watched the king she served retreat into absence for 5 years and was not willing to watch him lose the thing that had begun, finally, to bring him back. He was very still while she spoke. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment. Then, how long? She would have been notified today, Hattie said. Her contract voided by end of week. He nodded once, twice. Then he stood. The king didn't use a pen to sign the new contract. He found Ford in the hall. He stood over the chancellor, his alpha aura filling the room until the older man found it hard to breathe. You tried to exile a member of my pack, Everett whispered. Why, his voice like grinding stone. It was a face Hattie had not seen in 5 years. It was not grief. It was not composure. It was fury. Clean, directed, entirely focused fury. Ford, you have served me for a long time. You think you know the limits of my patience because you watched me mourn for 5 years. You think the king is tired. You think the alpha is old. A low, guttural growl rippled through his chest, a sound of pure, ancient dominance. You have served me for 17 years, Ford. And in 17 years, you have never once made the mistake of confusing your authority with mine. Do not start now. If you touch her position in this keep again, if you touch anything that belongs to her, I will remind you in very specific terms exactly whose name is on this throne. And I promise you, the lesson will not require a second delivery. Chapter 10. She heard about the protection decree from Hattie, which meant she heard about it in the specific, compact way that Hattie communicated information, precisely, without embellishment. He's signed it, Wren, Hattie said, sliding a heavy parchment across the desk. A decree of perpetual wardship. It keeps you inside the keep. It keeps the chancellor's hands off you, but it also keeps you in the shadows, just where your birth mother left you. Wren didn't finish her tea. The warmth of the liquid felt like ash in her throat. She had grown up hidden in the southern provinces because a queen was too afraid to claim her. Sarah had loved her, fiercely, completely, without reservation. But even Sarah had kept her secrets. Now, a king was doing the exact same thing all over again, protecting her, hiding her, deciding for her. She wasn't surprised by the chancellor's cruelty, but she was blindsided by Everett's silence. She didn't wait for Aldous Webb to summon her. She moved through the stone corridors with a purpose that made the other servants scatter. When she reached the east study, she didn't knock. She threw the heavy oak doors open. Everett was standing at the window, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the dying amber light of the afternoon. He didn't turn. He didn't have to. He knew her scent. He knew the rhythm of her breathing. I signed it to save your life, he said, his voice a low, weary rumble. You signed it to save your conscience. Wren's voice cracked through the stillness of the room. You didn't ask me, Everett. You decided for me, just like she did. You're trading my freedom for your peace of mind. Everett turned then, and for the first time, the 45-year-old Alpha King looked every bit his age. His gray-green eyes were turbulent, flashing with a primal protective gold that he could no longer suppress. You have no idea the wolves at the gate, Wren. Ford is just the beginning. If the northern kingdoms find out who you are, then let them come. She stepped into his space, her face tilted up to his. I spent 24 years being a secret. Sarah kept me hidden. Mira kept me buried. I am done being the thing powerful people hide so they don't have to deal with the mess of the world. It is not about the world, Everett roared, his alpha aura suddenly exploding into the room like a physical weight. The sheer pressure of his power, raw and unchecked for 5 years, hit the air like a storm. Wren recoiled, her boots catching on the edge of the heavy rug. She stumbled back, losing her footing, and hit the stone floor hard. Silence fell. It was the specific, terrifying silence of a room that had just stopped breathing. Wren looked up from the stone floor, her dark hair spilling out of its braid, her chest heaving with a fury that mirrored his own. She was on her knees, but she was not in submission. "You aren't protecting me, Everett," she said, her voice cutting through the silence with absolute precision. "You're burying me. You're so afraid of losing her again that you're turning me into a ghost before I'm even dead." Everett froze. He stood over her, his jaw working, his hands shaking at his sides. He looked like a man coming apart at the seams. For 15 years, he had been the perfect, stoic king. For 5 years, he had been a hollow statue of grief. But in this moment, looking at this girl who refused to be small, who had refused her entire life to be reduced to the secret others needed her to be, the mask shattered. He dropped to his own knees. The heavy thud of his weight echoed in the silence. He didn't reach for her like a king. He reached for her like a drowning man grasping for the shore. "Wren," he whispered. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a declaration. It was a broken, reverent prayer. The sound of a man who had been carrying the weight of a ghost for 5 years and had just in this moment, on this cold stone floor, set it down. His hand came up to her face. One hand, careful, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with the deliberateness of someone who has been thinking about this exact motion for longer than they intend to admit. "You are not her," he rasped, his eyes searching hers. "I know," she whispered, her hand covering his. "You are exactly, entirely, completely yourself," he said, "and I have been a fool to try and cage you." He kissed her then, not with the calculated grace of a monarch, but with the hunger of a man who had been starving and had finally found home. She kissed him back with everything she was, no longer invisible, no longer careful. Just herself. They were both on their knees on the cold stone floor, but for the first time in 5 years, the Alpha King was finally standing tall. They were both on the floor, both finally honest. But there was still the letter, the full letter, the one he had not yet shown her entirely. And what was in the final pages was going to change everything she thought she understood about why Sarah had never told her the truth. Chapter 11. He showed her the letter 2 days later. He brought it to the library. He sat beside her now, always beside her, the table's old geography a memory, and set the letter between them on the oak surface. She could see, in the slight tension in his hands, that this was the final ghost he had to lay to rest. Mira Hartwell Maddox had been, as her portrait suggested, a woman of considerable clarity and intelligence. The letter was not long. It was not sentimental. She wrote about the choice she had made to leave Wren in the South with Sarah, and what it had cost her every day of her 15-year marriage to Everett. Wren's fingers trembled as she reached the middle of the parchment. "I never sent for you," the Queen had written. "I never sent a single gold mark or a message to Sarah beyond what was arranged at the beginning. Every month for 15 years, Everett's spymaster searched my rooms for signs of divided loyalty. If I had sent a messenger to the southern provinces, the king's enemies would have found you within the week. They would have used you as a weapon against the crown. I had to let you be nobody. Because in this kingdom, Wren, being nobody was the only way you could stay alive. I traded my motherhood for your breath. I want you to know that I made that trade willingly. And I want you to know that Sarah Calloway was not just a guardian. She was the bravest woman I have ever known. She loved you not because she was paid to. She loved you because you were worth loving. I knew that from the moment I held you." Wren read it twice. Something settled in her chest, the jagged hole left by a lifetime of not knowing finally beginning to close at its edges. She thought about Sarah's hands in her hair. She thought about a woman who had been paid for a service and had given a life instead. She turned to the last section. Mira wrote about Everett. He is a good man, but he will grieve in the wrong direction for too long. This is his nature. Eventually, something will return him to himself. I hope it is something worthy of him. I hope it is something that does not carry my face. Because that would be an unkind joke of fate's. Wren set the letter down and let out a short, breathy laugh. Everett was watching her. She wrote, Wren said, that fate is not cruel for its own sake. Yes, he said, his voice thick. And then I walked in wearing her face, Wren said. And you think that's not fate being cruel, he said. I think, she said, looking him directly in the eyes, that it is fate being precise. She knew you needed to be shocked back to life. She just didn't realize that the person who did it would be the one thing she loved more than you. She reached across and covered his hand with hers. He turned his hand over and held it, his grip firm and certain. She would have liked you, he said. I think I would have liked her, Wren said. But I think she'd be glad to know I'm not planning on staying in her shadow. The letter had told her everything, but it had also told her something about Sarah, something she had not expected. And the woman she had grown up calling her guardian had just become, in the final pages of a dead queen's handwriting, something far more than that. Epilogue. Spring came to Veldrath with a ferocity that matched the mood in the castle. The announcement was made in early March, but it wasn't the wardship decree the Chancellor had expected. The announcement, signed by the king's own hand, recognized Wren Calloway not as a servant or a ward, but as the Princess of Ashfeld and the future Luna of Veldrath. It was a declaration of war against the gossiping lords and a declaration of love to the world. That evening, the library was quiet, lit only by the golden glow of the hearth. Everett sat at the long oak table, but he wasn't looking at ledgers. He was looking at Wren. She was no longer wearing the rough wool of a servant. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk, her dark hair loose and shimmering in the firelight. The council is still reeling, Everett said, his alpha voice humming with a satisfaction he hadn't felt in decades. They expected me to hide you. They expected me to be ashamed of the secret. And instead, Wren asked, leaning against the table, instead, I told them that I have spent 5 years living with a ghost, and I have no intention of spending another second without the woman who brought me back to life. He stood up, moving with that effortless, powerful grace, and stopped in front of her. He pulled a heavy gold signet ring from his finger, not the king's seal, but his family's private crest. He didn't put it on the table. He took her hand and slid it onto her thumb. I am not looking for a replacement, Wren. I am looking for my queen. When the solstice comes, I want a wedding that the northern kingdoms will talk about for 100 years. Wren looked at the ring, then at the man who had finally stepped out of the shadows for her. She walked to the portrait gallery one last time. She looked at Mira Hartwell's face, her birth mother's face, the face she wore, the face that had started all of this. And she did not feel like an echo anymore. She felt like a continuation. What are you thinking? Everett asked, coming up behind her, his hands resting on her waist, his heat radiating through the silk of her dress. I'm thinking about Sarah, Wren said quietly. She told me that people who get noticed get examined. She spent 19 years making sure I wasn't noticed, making sure I wasn't examined. She paused. I think she always knew that one day I would be ready. She was just buying me time until I was. Everett leaned down, his lips brushing the sensitive skin of her neck, sending a shiver of pure alpha recognition through her blood. And have you been examined thoroughly enough, my future queen?" Ren turned in his arms, her eyes blazing with that same defiance he had seen on the stone floor. "Not yet," she whispered, pulling him down to her. "But I have a feeling we have the rest of our lives to finish the assessment." He kissed her then, a king no longer mourning and a girl no longer invisible. She was nobody's ghost. She was nobody's echo. She was nobody's secret, kept in the southern provinces like something shameful, raised to be invisible by a guardian who had loved her as completely as any mother could. She was Wren Calloway of Caldermere, the girl who had come north because she was cold and stayed because she had been seen for the first time in her life by a man who had forgotten what it felt like to see anything at all. Behind her, Everett's arms tightened around her waist, not possessively, not like a king securing something he owned, but the way a man holds something he almost lost before he understood its value. His lips brushed her temple. She felt it move through her like the first warmth after a long winter. She looked at Mira Hartwell's portrait one last time. Not with grief, not with the complicated vertigo of resemblance, with the specific peace of a woman who has stopped living inside someone else's story and understood, fully, completely, without apology, that she was the beginning of her own. She thought about Sarah, the woman who had braided her hair and told her to stay small and kept a queen's secret for 19 years with the fierce, quiet loyalty of someone who understood exactly what they were protecting and why. She thought, "I hope you knew. I hope somewhere in those 19 years you understood that what you were keeping safe was worth every word you never said." "Ready?" Everett murmured against her hair. She turned away from the portrait. She took his hand. "More than I have ever been," she said. And she meant it for everything, for the council, for the kingdom, for the wedding at solstice, for the man beside her, for the life that had begun improbably and perfectly, meet with a broken tray on a stone floor and a king who could not look away. She walked out of the portrait gallery with her head up and her hand in his, and the spring light falling golden across the stone floors of Veldrath Keep. The girl they had tried to erase had become the woman nobody would ever forget.